years ago, I wrote a novel called Eva Moves the Furniture, which was about my mother's relationship with the supernatural. My mother had died when I was quite young, and all I had was a handful of stories out of which I spun this novel. And then in 2017, I discovered that I wasn't an orphan in the sense of having no living relatives, that I had many living relatives. They just all happened to be in or around Brisbane in Australia. And when I eventually went to visit them, I discovered that my great-grandmother, Lizzie Malcolm, although I shouldn't say that, my great-grandmother, Lizzie Craig, had the gift of second sight, that she could see the future, and she could also, according to her descendants, read tea leaves and had healing hands. And that really interested me, because what I had thought was my mother's unique gift, I suddenly thought, oh, this is hereditary. I come from a family of seers, even though at my rather advanced age, I've so far failed to see anything.
I always lament this about people who are in touch with the supernatural, people who see ghosts. I want to see one. Please let something cool happen to me. Never happens.
Yeah. I'm waiting every night.
Yeah, right. But okay, so this is really, as a creative exercise, you exploring your own genealogy imaginatively. Is that accurate?
Yes. Broadly speaking, that's accurate. I mean, once again, the fact that I knew so little made things easier imaginatively. I actually knew more about my grandmother, but precisely because I knew more about her, I felt the story was already written, whereas my great-grandmother was sufficiently hazy that she invited me.
Okay, so just to try to trace the family tree, great-grandmother was Lizzie? Is that right?
Correct.
And then grandmother was Barbara.
Yes.
Okay, and I know from doing some research, I believe, didn't Lizzie, the great-grandmother, die when Barbara was born? Didn't she die in childbirth, or is that not accurate?
No, she didn't die in childbirth, but my grandmother died in childbirth.
Oh, and she gave birth to your mother, of course. Yes, of course.
No, I'm sorry, it's so confusing.
It is, yeah. But it's interesting. And you were raised in Scotland on the grounds of a boys' school.
Yes.
Your father was a math and geography teacher. Your mother was the school nurse there. And what I found interesting as I was reading up is that both of your parents were only children. Is that right? And you're an only child?
Yes.
So in terms of hereditary, the gift of second sight is a hereditary gene somehow in your family, though it might have skipped you. But then also it's interesting to me that only children seems to be a thing, at least in your immediate biological sphere.
Yes, it is, and happily and perhaps rather confusingly, when I talk about my life, on the one hand, I talk about myself as an orphan with no relatives until 2017, and on the other hand, I have this family whom I very successfully adopted many decades ago. So I refer to my sisters and my brother
And these were people in Scotland. I believe it was the father was Roger, and he was the English teacher.
Yeah, Roger taught at the same school as my father.
And
they left their door open and I just ran into their house.
Okay. But it's interesting to me because I think a lot of times when I talk to writers, they tend to pick up at least the love of reading from one of their parents. Sometimes they have a parent who's a writer or who is someone who would wish they could have written. That's a common story. But it seems to me like this adopted father, Roger, was a big influence on you. Clearly, right? Did he pass along his love of books to you in a way that really set you on your course?
Roger very much did, but I would also say that my father and my stepmother unwittingly did, because reading was one of the few activities they praised me for. Climbing trees, chasing the dog, making mud pies, trying to collect birds' nests, all the sort of things I did running around, they frowned on, but reading was good. So on both sides, I got encouragement.
And you have described your childhood and your home life as Dickensian, severe. Like these are adjectives that I've read you use in interviews.
Yeah.
It was tough.
It was hard. I mean, it was Dickensian, I think, in that the two adults were just, my father and stepmother were just so remote and had no interest in having a child. And then we had very few modern conveniences. We didn't have a phone or a refrigerator or a television until I was 9. The first real memory I have of television is seeing the news about Kennedy. So it felt like we were tracing our footsteps back to another century, which, when it came to writing about Lizzie Craig, was very helpful.
I was going to say, this book feels like it is built from these bits and pieces, as books tend to be, from your life. And one of the things about it that I so admire is your ability to write place. It's very vivid in my imagination, despite the fact that I have never been to Scotland or the Scottish Highlands or the nearby the Scottish Highlands. And you're great at writing nature. You're great at capturing animals on the page, birds, cows. I don't know. That kind of stuff just comes vividly to life. And this is the environment in which you grew up.
It is, and I would say that this is very much my version of a COVID novel. Suddenly, in the spring of 2020, I realised I wasn't going to be able to go back to Scotland anytime soon, and that was so upsetting. And the only way I knew how to deal with it was by going there in my imagination every day.
Oh, interesting. That is, I did not, usually I can detect, it's usually fairly explicit when a book is a COVID novel these days, because it's, there's references to masks, or people are taking up pottery and getting frustrated with their children or whatever. But you're in a completely different time. You're in like the late Victorian era in Scotland, but you are very much outdoors and on a farm, and I can see how that would be imaginatively appealing.
Yeah. No, it was very, the road from Belhaven was my magic carpet. I got to go to Scotland every day.
Yeah, it's lovely in that way. Where were you during where were you sheltering? I'm curious.
I was sheltering in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay. So that was a rough time, the pandemic. And yet I feel like when I talk to writers, a lot of writers were productive. I often hear from writers that things weren't, quote unquote, that much different, considering how insular writers can be.
Right.
I mean, we've been sort of sheltering in place our whole lives, many of us,
Yes.
It's not to make light, but it really, as a lifestyle, was maybe not that big of a leap for the literary set.
Yeah. Yeah. We were better prepared than many other people.
I think psychologically better prepared.
Yes.
I think that the mode that a lot of people had so much trouble adjusting to is a mode that most writers are fairly comfortable with.
Yeah.
That was the case for you.
Yeah, in many ways, it was a stressful time, but it was also unstressful because I could read and write and go for walks. And everything was sort of simplified.
Yeah, I felt the same way. Like the social obligations were curtailed, and you had a kind of like a winnowed down list of possibilities, which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, as it turns out. But I really, really love the nature aspect of this book, and it's not necessarily all easy. Like farm life, the difficulties of farm life, particularly in that era, are really brought into focus, and it's really approaching the era of mechanized farm work. Some of that is depicted in the novel. So you're right on the cusp of
Right.
kind of the old school way of farming, which was very much just human labor,
Yeah.
to using, plow, like motorized plows and combines and all that kind of stuff, which simplified things. And I am curious to know how much research you had to do to capture it so well and to make it come off on the page like in such a lived-in way.
I had two things that helped me immensely. One was that from the ages of 9 to 13, I didn't live at the boys' school. I lived in a village in the borders of Scotland. And on the outskirts of this village was a farm run by a brother and sister that I think hadn't changed in 100 years. And I went there every day to feed the hens and milk the cows, and I kept pigeons there. And, I thought I was being very helpful, though how much help I was at the age of 9 or 10, I'm not certain. And then I also found a wonderful diary that had been kept by a farmer near where Lizzie's farm was in Fife. And it was an extremely dull and detailed account of farming, and it was just unbelievably helpful.
Interesting, but dull. That's what's interesting.
Yes. Yeah. It was just rain, planted turnips, repaired fence, Sam cut his foot. It was just a list of facts.
That's right. But that's farm work, though. It's just
Yeah.
there's just stuff that has to get done every
Yes.
day,
Yeah.
and it's a lot of hard labor, as it turns out. And like things like injuries,
Yeah.
They really can have a huge impact on livelihood. There's
Yeah.
something dramatic about even like a cut foot.
Yeah.
If it eliminates your ability to get out and do the work because no one else is going to show up to do it, right? So it's like
Yeah.
it can ruin you if you
Yeah.
break a leg. So
Yeah.
I also read that as a child you were a bird watcher, that you and your father were like avid bird watchers. This was something that you guys shared.
Yes.
And
Yeah. No, I was going to say, he was 55 when I was 5, and he was an elderly 55. So bird watching was one of the few things he really liked doing that I was interested in. And it was, again, it was rather dull for a child. You wait and wait and wait behind a bush, and then a yellowhammer flashes by and you sort of miss it.
right.
But I did learn his love of birds and learn to recognize birds by flight and sound.
And so you can like, is this something you've carried with you into adulthood? Like, do you bird watch?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I bird watch. I observe birds with pleasure. I always notice them.
And do you have an unusual knowledge of like the birds, say in Cambridge? When you walk outside, can you look at a bird and name it and watch its flight pattern and know what it is?
I'm still a bit shaky on American birds as opposed to Scottish birds. But, if you come to Fife with me, I'll name you every bird we see.
Right. Yeah, it was funny when I was reading the essay that you wrote about your trip to Brisbane, where you went and kind of met your cousins, and the birds in Australia radically different. I spent time down there. I actually went to Queensland University in Brisbane when I was in college. And I remember that vividly, just walking around campus and being like, what is the noise I'm hearing? This is different.
Right. It's completely different. Yes.
Yeah. It's lovely down there, though. So I want to ask you a bit more about the like supernatural aspect of this, because Lizzie, your heroine, has second sight, and she sees what are called pictures, or what she refers to as pictures, where she can usually see bad things prior to their happening. That's the pattern, right? It's usually bad things.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if this is something you have drawn from family history. Was this the pattern in your family? Did they ever see good things?
Well, I do have Lizzie see some ordinary things, like somebody getting a new hat, for instance. So there are meant to be more mundane things. I have two friends who can see the future in a very ordinary sort of way. And I talked to both of them about what that experience was like. So Lizzie's experience is modeled on my understanding of what they described. Just it's as if the teeth of time slip and they can suddenly see something and then they slip back again.
That's so wild. And yet that's so wild. And yet I am prepared 100% to believe it. I think there are people who, I think it's pretty clear that there are people who can see things because there's evidence. Like, I want to say, wasn't it your grandmother or great grandmother who saw the beginning of the Crimean War or something? Like,
very, very good, Brad. What she saw was that the Japanese would enter the Second World War on the side of the Germans, which was completely unexpected.
But you can corroborate that, is the point.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
That's wild. And I guess we have no idea what that is. There's just some sort of larger consciousness that they can tap into. Or I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. The teeth of time slipping is maybe a better way to put it.
Yeah.
So I want to get into the magic of this book for me, which is how absorbing it is and how there's not, I mean, I guess there are some like very dramatic things that happen, but it's not a book that I would describe as having like pyrotechnics in it. This is a book about a young woman's life, her coming of age and her finding her way in her life and coming up against difficult circumstances, familial, cultural, societal. There are barriers to what a young woman could expect from her life in this time that we see Lizzie come up against. So that's where some of the drama is drawn from. We're wondering what's going to happen to her. But you do such a seamless job of moving us through her life and through time. And you make the reader, you made me care so much about her fate. How did you do that?
That if only all questions in my life were phrased like this, I would be a much, much happier woman. I did work very hard. I had a number of ambitions when I began the novel. I wanted to write a short novel that covered around 10 years in Lizzie's life. And I wanted to write a novel that was set in the past, but didn't have the kind of baggage that one sometimes thinks of in connection with a historical novel, that it just happened to be taking place there. I mean, it's essentially taking place in the 1880s. I don't mean to sound like it's hovering above things, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time explaining to you how the sewage system worked, for instance. Or,
Thank you.
Where water came from. And I also, I knew the novel would sort of succeed or fail by how much I could make the reader care about Lizzie. And I was really trying to mirror that feeling I confess I often had in childhood and have less often as an adult, of just falling into a book and caring so much about Anne of Green Gables, say, or Heidi, or Pippi Longstocking, or Jane Eyre, all those great female characters. So I was really trying to learn and to learn from those people, to learn how to make the reader feel, oh, this really, really matters.
Well, I feel like there is some kind of homage to the books you've mentioned. It's like the Bronte, it's Virginia Woolf, all that kind of, like that era. This book feels like it is in some ways an homage to that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And when you're putting together the character of Lizzie, sort of building her out of some of the raw materials of your own life, but I feel like the fact of her orphanhood, because she is raised by her grandparents. She's lost both of her parents at a young age and has really only ever known her grandparents as her caregivers. And then at a certain point in the book realizes that she has a sister. So she has this is a character who is in a kind of precarious family situation, though her grandparents are loving. They are not, they're not bad people. Her grandfather's a bit stern, but I feel like that's accurate to the time, right? But I definitely found myself worried for her because she was being raised by older adults, and she was going to have to sort of be on her own sooner than she otherwise would have been, right? At least when it comes to just basic chronology. And there's something too about the self-contained nature of Belhaven, this farm, and the way that rural life unfolded back then and continues to unfold in some spots where they just kind of live in their own world. There aren't necessarily neighbors right next door. And so much of her existence unfolds on that land and within that family, and whatever help might show up. There's a guy named Hugh who she befriends. Her sister eventually comes. So people do come into her life, but not a ton, right?
Yeah. No. And I owe a great debt to the Scottish writer Lewis Grassic Gibbon's wonderful novel Sunset Song, which is set in the 1900s, running up to the First World War. And his heroine, Chris, lives on an isolated farm, and there's that sense of the farm as its own world with its own rules. And there are neighbours who help out at harvest and sheep shearing and lambing, but they're not readily available.
Yeah. I'm capable of idealizing that life. It sounds lovely to have your own land and to just be sort of tucked away and be able to see the stars and all that kind of stuff. But it's a hard life too.
It's a hard life, yes.
It's a hard life physically, but also the isolation. I guess it depends on what your temperament is. But, so a lot of people would struggle with that sort of thing.
And you're also so much at the mercy of things completely outside your control. The weather, the price of barley. Things can be going very well, and then it rains for 4 days and you lose half your crops. So it's a very capricious life.
That's right. And some sort of parasite can come in and just wipe out your entire livelihood in a season. So another thing that I want to ask you about has to do with Lizzie's life as it unfolds in this novel, and what appears to be, to me, your deep interest in, I guess you would call it fate, but the way in which a person's life unfolds, and in particular how it is impacted by specific moments of change, intersections with other people who have a dramatic impact on your life. Like, this really is something that happens to human beings. Like, we think back on the narrative of our own lives and we can point to moments or decisions, things that happened that really altered the course of our destiny. And you just talk a little bit about that, because I feel like this is maybe one of your keener interests in the book, to kind of locate these moments in Lizzie's life and to trace the course of her young, at least, destiny.
No, I find this fascinating in my own life and in those of people I encounter. That it can seem that a person is going from A to B to C, that the path is rolling out before them, and then suddenly there's a swerve or a jump. Perhaps they meet someone, perhaps they fail an exam, perhaps they get a job, perhaps they decide to go to Samoa. That something very unexpected occurs. And I find that tremendously interesting, the unpredictability and the sense one has, the way in which one revises the story in retrospect to make it seem fated. But of course, in advance, it's completely unpredictable.
I mean, we all have these moments. And I want to say I read you had a moment in your youth. What was it, like you met somebody on the tube in London, and that was how you ended up in North America, more or less, right? So that was a moment for you.
Yeah, it's a moment for me. And yes, it's not surprising that I'm interested in these moments.
Well, we all have them. And I think we
Yeah.
all have moments at least where we reflect and take an interest. And it's a little, it's, it can be awesome to think back if there's some pivotal moment that happened that led you to great things, but it can also be unnerving because you can look back and be like, wow, you know, I would have avoided so much trouble had I not done X or had I not met Y, but that's life. And
Yeah.
I think some of it's in our control and some of it's not.
No, and of course, we like to think, we're encouraged to think, perhaps particularly in the West, that we do have control, that we are making informed choices. But we're all living in the grip of history and chance.
That's right. And I think for Lizzie, growing up on this farm and living at a remove from certainly from urban life and having the set of experiences that affords her, uh, the choices that she makes and the events as they unfold that lead her to spending time in Glasgow. I think what we're talking about speaks to that part of the novel, because this is, in addition to being a coming of age story, it is also a tale of like country and city.
Yeah, very
Right.
much. Yes.
So I'm curious to know about your upbringing. Seems to have been fairly rural, and maybe experiences that you had in Glasgow or in other cities that might have colored the writing of this novel.
Yeah, no, you're quite right, Brad. I grew up in, either the country, the boys' school, or in this very small village where I went to the farm. And when I discovered cities, which I did as a teenager, I thought, oh, this is amazing. This is fantastic. And it remains a big division in my life, the pleasure of the city and all the things we get out of cities, and the beauty of the countryside, and the pleasures of the countryside. So in an ideal world, I think we all ought to be able to go back and forth, but the world is less than ideal.
I was going to say, yeah, it seems
Yeah.
like you've sort of stuck to cities as
Yes.
an adult. That's the lean of things, but I think that's just a necessity, right, with work and.
Yeah.
But I have the same feeling. Like I live in Los Angeles, I always long. You can imagine, I long for going someplace that's not so crowded.
Yes.
And if I could have but I would miss the city. So I would
Yeah.
love to have a little of both. That's the ideal outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And have the choice to be able to
Yes.
decide
Yeah.
when you want to be where.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you were growing up and you said you discovered cities as a teenager. I would imagine there were trips to Glasgow. Is that what it was? Or
Actually, to Edinburgh. Glasgow was not a city I got to know until I really started going there as an adult, and then went more often on Lizzie's behalf. Um, so Edinburgh was the first city, and then London.
got it. And you said going to Glasgow on Lizzie's behalf. That means you were doing trips for research.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh. And how often, before the pandemic notwithstanding, how often do you get back to Scotland?
I usually go 3 or 4 times a year. I and sometimes, occasionally, more often if I can make up excuses.
That's good.
So I have to not think about my carbon footprint. My adopted brother, is a tree planter in London, and I make donations to buy trees.
So I would love to talk with you about your writing routine. You have published what now? We're in the double digits now. How many novels have you published? This your 11th?
I think I published a collection of stories, and I think this is my ninth novel.
Oh, ninth
Maybe.
novel, but double digit books.
Yes.
So you've been productive.
Moderate. I got off to a slow start, but I've managed to be relatively productive since I started publishing. Yes.
So let's talk about that slow start, because I imagine there are people listening who might be mired in a slow start, and this could give them some hope. So what was it like for you at the beginning?
I happily, I was living with someone who had stable employment at a university, and I supported myself by waitressing. This was in Toronto, And I started to write short stories between lunch and dinner shifts at the restaurants where I worked. And they were all roundly rejected until I wrote a really very simple story about a young woman who was a waitress and who one night after work did what I did, which was to hitchhike home through Toronto, and what came of that. And once I'd written and published that story, I began to understand more about how stories worked, and I encountered a wonderful writing teacher named Brian Moore, to whom I took the same story 7 weeks in a row until he broke down and said it was finished.
That was the hitchhiking story.
No, it was a different story.
Oh, it was. Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
what was the hitchhiking story called?
I think, I can't remember. Was it called Someone Else's? It was quite short.
But it was published?
It was published in a small Canadian magazine, I mean, of the kind we cherish and love.
And so how long did you spend, I guess we would refer to this as like your apprenticeship, all the years you were writing stories that could not find a home and that were not good enough for the page, the printed page? Like, how long were you apprenticing?
Well, first I wrote a terrible novel, and then I wrote short stories. So maybe adding those two together, close to 10 years. And then I had published some stories, and I saw an article in the Toronto Globe and Mail about an editor named Cynthia Good at Penguin Books in Canada. And she was starting her own imprint, publishing collections of stories. And so I sent her a couple of stories and said, would you like to publish me? I mean, I didn't really know how the world worked, so it seemed an okay thing to do. And 9 months later, I got back a tiny note of the kind people used to use to record phone messages in the days when there were phone messages. And she said, Dear Margot Livesey, I would like to publish your stories, but you have to write some more. And that led to my first book, a collection of stories. And yeah.
So do you remember where you were when you got that note?
Yes, I was at Tufts University, where I had a very adjunct position.
And it must have been a thrill.
It was hugely thrilling.
And I mean, there are no rules. It's worth remembering. I know it was a different time in publishing and everything, but that's not the first time I've heard of somebody just writing to an editor and being like, hey, here I am.
Yes. Yes.
And if the stories are good, the reality is that editors live for that. They want to find writing that really speaks to them and that they want to publish. I mean, I don't think it matters how they get it necessarily.
Yeah.
So you were off and running from there.
I wouldn't say running, but I was often walking. I was walking in the right direction, and I began to understand how to do things. And yes, I became someone whose life was much more organized around writing and less around waitressing.
Is it possible to locate specific things that you learned when you say you learned how things worked? You're talking about how things worked in fiction. Mm-hmm. Like what was something that you weren't doing in earlier failed efforts that you learned how to do once you were up and walking, as you say?
Well, I think what I knew about writers, despite my university degree, came from my image of 19th century writers just sitting in parlours and kitchens and writing away. And you wrote, and then there was Wuthering Heights, or you wrote, and there was Great Expectations. So it took me a long time to realise that, for me at least, that was not what happened. I wrote, and then I had to spend a lot of time revising to make something good, that I was not someone for whom the words leapt up on the page without effort. And once I understood that I could make things better, then my work took a big step forward.
So you were, as a young writer, you had the pressure that you were putting on yourself that you had to get it right the first time, essentially.
I don't know if I put pressure on myself. I just thought it would be right the first time. And if it wasn't, there was nothing to be done.
It's just hopeless.
It was more like, say, cooking a meal. Like, you can't revise a meal.
Right.
Usually.
Right.
So it took me a while to realize, no, it wasn't like that. You actually could make things better in significant ways.
So nowadays, what does it look like for you, like generally speaking, in terms of drafting?
Well, I aspire to write every morning for 2 or 3 hours before I descend into the world of my students' wonderful work and MasterCard bills and things like that.
Uh-huh.
And it usually takes about maybe 18 months for me to have a draft of a novel, and then maybe I revise it for another year, something like that.
And do you work? And are you working on word count? Like, do you hold yourself to some metric to get through a draft in a timely fashion?
I have different metrics. Sometimes it's time. Sometimes I have to write 500 words or I have to write 1,000 words. Um, Usually one or the other.
And so with Road to Belhaven, and you're not working from an outline?
No, um, I had an idea of the destination of the novel, which I can't describe for you because it will spoil the plot. But so I sort of knew where I was heading, but I did not know the route, and there were many wrong turns.
So you had the ending in mind, essentially.
Yes.
Is that common? Do you usually have that ending in mind when you write a novel?
Well, I think the one thing I learned from the truly terrible novel I wrote in my early 20s was that it was very helpful to have an ending in mind rather than to sort of, that novel just wandered from place to place.
Uh-huh.
And then suddenly the ending appeared a bit like a dog jumping onto your lap. And
But you
you went,
got it.
well, no, I mean, it was terrible. It was terrible, Brad, because the ending came out of nowhere.
Right, right. And you're just like, what? I just got to get, I got to get out of this novel, essentially.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so no, it's a disaster. But it did occur to me after that it would be helpful to think, oh, this is what I'm heading for.
Well, Virginia Woolf, there's the famous line that she said that all one needs to do is to find the rhythm of a novel and everything else follows.
Yes.
And I read where you said, quote, "I'm not sure that's quite true, but I am increasingly aware of how much the rhythm and the level of detail determine what's possible." And I guess when it comes to the rhythm, it's just the rhythm of the sound of the voice on the page, the sound of the novel. Is that what you think she meant? Is that what you mean?
I think it means more than that. I think it does mean the music of the language and the sound of the sentences. But I also think it means setting the level of detail. That you can tell when you start Beloved, say, Toni Morrison's wonderful novel, you can tell that this novel is going to have quite a high level of detail. And you can tell when you start, say, Penelope Fitzgerald's The Beginning of Spring, that the novel is going to be fairly tight and spare. So I think every writer is trying to figure out the level of detail they need to create their world.
Yeah, and that's like something that I marveled at reading your book is you're rendering, a distant time and place. This story unfolds, what, like 120 years ago, or more than that,
Yeah,
even,
yeah.
and I believed it from word one.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, you weren't describing how the sewage system worked, blessedly, but you were describing other things, and you have to make those choices. I I can. I mean, that seems daunting to me to write a book that takes place in like the late Victorian era in Scotland, and the process of trial and error that you go through in the drafting and the revision when it comes to like landing on your level of detail. Like, what does that look like? Did you go overboard and then have to kind of peel back, or did you, in revision, find yourself adding more than subtracting?
I think this is the moment to say that I'm blessed by the friendship of a wonderful writer, Andrea Barrett. Her most recent collection of stories is Natural History, and most of her work is historical. And she is an amazingly accurate writer and is fantastic at research. So she's very good at asking me those questions that prompt me to think, okay, how did people have bicycles then? Or how was a colliery working? Or how did the coal get from A to B? And she does research ahead of time and then refines the novel out of the research. And I tend to write the novel and then dash around doing the research and weaving it in. But my novels would be infinitely poorer if it were not for Andrea's help.
So she reads as you're going and kind of helps you fill in details.
Yes.
And it's like, by the way, you need to get rid of the cell phone in this scene. Lizzie does not have,
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
because it can be easy, I think, even if you're, trying to stick to the truth of the play, it can be very easy to mess up a detail. And I guess the average reader wouldn't notice it, but you still don't want those in there. Because if an Andrea Barrett picks up the book and reads it and sees it, then you're going to be in trouble on your Amazon review.
Yes. The dreaded Amazon review.
That's right. That's right. So you are is your husband a painter? Did I read that correctly?
My husband paints wonderful abstract oil paintings, which are sometimes a little bit like novels. He works on them sometimes for many months, many layers, and then they emerge and are beautiful.
So a question that I have has to do with, I'm always interested when I speak with somebody who is partnered with an artist in a different medium, and what the dialogue creatively might be like between you and how they might feed each other. Like, do you derive some sort of creative benefit when it comes to your writing from your husband's work?
I think I do, but it perhaps would not be easy to fully articulate what it is. I think one thing is that he passionately believes in art and in things taking their time. So that's very, very helpful. If you sat in on our supper time conversations, you would hear Eric being wonderfully witty and well informed because he's been listening to NPR, and me, who spent the day reading the dictionary or looking at an account of 19th century farming, offering something about the Achilles turnip. So I think I benefit much more than he does.
Well, and I heard you say a second ago that you feel like his abstract oil paintings are novel-like.
Yes. Yeah.
How so?
Well, I think because they take quite a long time to get onto the canvas, and because he creates a lot of depth, and so you have a sense of looking into them. And I aspire in what I write that there's a sense of depth, a sense of a world beyond the pages.
And you talked about the drafting process and how typically it takes you 18 months to get a first draft done. And then I think you said you edited for a year on The Road from Belhaven, more or less. Does that time span square with most of your novels? Is it similar from book to book? Because I feel like writers will often have a fairly regular incubation for their books, and it can differ. But is that normal for you to spend about 2.5, 3 years on a book?
I think at the moment it is. In the case of Eva Moves the Furniture, the novel I mentioned earlier about my mother and the supernatural, I wrote it over 12 years and many drafts, but also doing many other things. And in the case of a novel called Criminals, I wrote a draft in 3 weeks at the MacDowell Artists Colony and then revised it for a year. But I think the normal rhythm is more the 2 to 3 years.
So for Eva Moves the Furniture.
Yes.
That's the one that took 12 years. Do you have a sense of why? I know you had other things going on, but was the story resisting you in ways that other books might not have?
I think the problem was that I thought, oh, I have a mother and that's fabulously interesting. And I didn't stop to think, oh, other people have mothers and they don't really need to know about mine. So it took me a long time to figure out how to make what I found privately interesting, publicly interesting.
Well, that's like, I think I've heard you say this before. I've read you say this before in an interview where like that's kind of one of the primary questions that you ask yourself as you're working on a novel
Yeah,
is, okay, this is interesting to me, but how can I make this interesting to the
yeah,
reader?
yeah.
How can I take my private concerns and make them interesting to the reader? It's the most elemental question to ask yourself. And yet, I feel like I and other writers perhaps often fail to ask that question and answer it sufficiently. It's a worthy question, is the point, right?
I think it's a very worthy question. My editor, my long-term editor, the wonderful Jennifer Barth, said to me once that when she's thinking about whether to take on a book, she always thinks, do I know 5 people who are not family members who would buy it in hardcover? And that I think of that in terms of just trying to think, well, why? I mean, there's so many books nowadays and so many claims on the reader's attention. What right do I have to claim their attention? How can I justify stopping them to listen to my story?
Well, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about how much I cared about Lizzie and her fate.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's the magic trick of this book and maybe any book that keeps you turning the pages, is that the writer is able to make you care. And I suppose, it begins with you deeply caring about your characters and her fate. And I guess these biographical pieces of your life that you've imbued the story with. But in terms of making like the pivot between that like self-generated interest and taking that and making it interesting to the reader and getting the reader to share your concern. That is a matter of language. Like it obviously all happens on the page, but that's the trick, right? How do you do that? How do you get me so invested in this young woman's life?
Well, I think part of it has to do with attitude and with trying to sense what her attitude is when she goes into a hen house or goes into a schoolroom or helps with the sheep shearing. So I was always trying to show her world, but through a kind of very opinionated lens, if you will.
I also was really struck by the lucidity of the prose. This is I would call this like a book that goes down easy. Like I was never lost. It's a very sophisticated book. It's not that I'm trying to say that it was simple or simple-minded, but I feel like you did the work as the writer to make sure that it was vivid and arresting, like in terms of setting and character. And there's just a real crystalline quality. I believe Lauren Groff blurbed this book and called, like she compared the book to like a cool mountain lake or something. I was like, yes, there's something very crystalline and beautifully rendered about your prose. And that's just hard labor. I mean, do you have any thoughts in terms of like your style of writing and your approach to the work line by line?
I think I'm one of those people who a lot of what I write early on are just sort of place markers and sort of lazy things. My characters are shrugging and nodding and turning and sighing, and then as I'm revising, I'm constantly trying to find more specific, more precise, um, more eloquent language to bring them to life, and details that seem richer and stranger, that seem more like telling details.
So you, like on subsequent drafts, are dispensing with some of the cliches and
I
maybe
hope.
like looking more closely. Like I feel like sometimes it's like there's a visual component to revision for me where you're basically seeing the scene more clearly maybe than
Yeah,
you initially did.
yeah. No, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, Francine Prose has a book, wonderful book, Reading as a Writer, but I think there's also a huge argument for sort of looking as a writer or seeing as a writer, that we're gradually bringing the worlds we're creating into focus.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering about your teaching life because you have taught in a lot of places. You mentioned Tufts earlier, but you've had a rich teaching history
Yes.
over the course of your career, and I'm always curious to hear how a writer's creative life is affected by their day job or their side hustle or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
teaching seems to be maybe one of the more symbiotic professions when it comes to a writing life. They feed one another. I have to believe that's the case for you since you've been doing it for so long. You get a lot from it too. In addition to having to give a lot, you do get a lot.
I feel incredibly privileged I teach at the half-time at the Iowa Writers Workshop. So I have fantastic students. I'm paid to reread books and stories I love, which seems like a great gift. And I'm allowed to be an early reader for many gifted young writers. And there's something inspiring about watching them create their worlds and trying to help them get them more clearly on the page. So initially, I found teaching truly terrifying, and I spent 40 hours a week preparing for a 2-hour class. But now I find, and I kept thinking waitressing is so much better. But now I think that I'm very fortunate to be in a world where reading and writing matters.
Yeah. And in terms of your approach as a teacher to, say, critique, it's a delicate responsibility, is it not? Because you're working with writers usually in the early stages. I guess it depends, but often in the early stages of a project. And I did some teaching earlier in my professional life, and I struggled with this a little bit, where I was sort of frozen in terms of what to say because I know how awful some of my early drafts look. And sometimes a very good piece of writing can emerge from that. So if you're too quick to condemn or to say something that might affect a writer's confidence,
Right.
you could stifle something that would otherwise turn out quite well. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know how you have over the years developed your approach to this part of the job of teaching creative writing.
No, that's a very good way of putting it. I think that, partly for me, it's about listening to the writer and hearing what they were after in the piece, what they hope to get on the page, even if it's not quite there yet. Partly it's trying to think about, the extent to which the writing is maybe holding something back, that it seems like the scene between Francesca and Tobias is just dreadful, but if the sentences were better, it would be fine. It's trying to sort of see through the scrim of not so good writing, trying to imagine that. Sometimes it's just helping a writer discover or think about what is truly their material, what they're really interested in.
It's interesting to me how often on this show over the years, I've talked to writers who have some version of this narrative where they'll say, I was trying to write this other book for years, even. They will spend trying to write a book that was resisting them. Yeah. And then suddenly they'll be like, and then on the side, I started writing kind of like as a joke almost, or as like a lark. They started writing this thing that was about their mother or the most important thing in their life, the thing they were trying to avoid. Yeah. And lo and behold, that's the one that turned out to have life. And we sort of have to surrender to our material in that way. And was there a process of arriving at that for you? Because I think I can see from reading The Road from Belhaven that there are themes that you're interested in, family being one of them. You think about Eva Moves the Furniture and The Road from Belhaven. You're clearly interested in this idea of family. There are certainly other things, but did you have a process of resistance before you finally yielded to what you're interested in?
Well, I think I have some ambivalence about family because having grown up in the way I did, I didn't want to be just defined in terms of my blood family, my very small actual relatives. So I'm very much in favor of the chosen family, however it's chosen or comes together, or the haphazard family. But I do think, going back to something you said earlier, there's a lot of luck in the artistic process. Sometimes, it's like we're going to the roulette table, and sometimes everything lines up and, things come together and we find the language and the structure and the characters and the occasion. And sometimes it's the reverse, and we have to struggle incredibly hard to get everything on the page. And I'm not sure that our struggles necessarily yield a better or worse book, but I do believe in artistic luck.
Yeah, I do too. Sometimes the story meets you halfway, or even better, and other
Yes.
times you have to travel.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
So I want to ask another craft question while I have you, related to revision. In particular, since you teach writing and are probably having conversations along these lines with students fairly regularly. But are there specific things when you are in the revision process that you are looking to do or remove from the text or add to the text? Like, in order to render writing that is this crystalline, like to get to that clarity and to get to that vividness and to get to that level of depth of character and all of it. Like, do you have a process? Are there specific things that you will do from book to book that you've sort of learned over the years to look for in your own work in order to like make it shine?
Well, I think that, I do at a later stage try to reread everything aloud, which is often tremendously tedious. But I do keep thinking, how is this advancing the novel? How is this making things go forward? How is this deepening the character? And at least in early drafts, I often have 2 or 3 scenes that are basically doing the same thing. And often I can condense them into one scene or have one scene and a brief summary. So for me, usually a lot of revising is about compressing or refining. And I think, yes, just trying to make sure that there isn't the wrong kind of repetition in a novel.
Well, I feel like sometimes too, you can realize that certain characters are performing the same function. So you'll compress characters. You hear that.
Yes, no, absolutely, yes.
But I think it's maybe the less common way of going about it. Sometimes writers add a lot in revision. It sounds like you do the bigger draft and then cut in subsequent revision.
Well, I have for the last 2 novels I wrote. I wanted, in each case, The Boy in the Field and The Road from Belhaven to be short novels. But I will confess, I just read Paul Murray's The Bee Sting. And I was just blown away by his 650 pages or whatever it is. And I thought, I was filled with envy. I thought, oh, why can't I do that? I mean, I don't think I can, but it did remind me of the pleasures of a longer book.
Listen, as somebody who has to read 2 and 3 books a week, I actually cannot like physically take on a 700 or 1,000-page novel. Right. It's very like when somebody sends me a book that's like 250 pages, I'm like, okay, we're in business. Like I can do this. And I think I appreciate as a reader, and I have often said this on this show, I appreciate compression and when writers are able to do quite a lot in a confined space. Yeah. But ultimately what matters most to me is just that it feels like there's no wasted motion. Yeah. And if there's no wasted motion in a 650-page novel, I'm there for it, right? It doesn't matter how long a book is. Yeah. Yeah. It matters whether or not I feel like there are needless repetitions, or it matters that the story is advancing and that I feel invested. And there's nothing better than like burning through a 700-page novel and feeling like it was effortless. Yeah. It sounds like that was the case with the Bee Sting.
Yeah, no, it was a great feeling. I have to say, it doesn't happen that often with longer books for me, so I cherished it.
Yeah, likewise. And so when you mentioned over the last 2 novels that you wanted to write shorter novels, was it with that ambition, like to try to compress and to be as efficient as possible and to write something that just doesn't have any wasted motion? Or is it simply a matter of preference as a reader? Like, this is the kind of book I want to write?
I think it was, I actually read quite a lot of longer books. I think it was partly that I had an idea of trying to use sort of poetry and rhythm in a certain way to get the reader to a certain place. And perhaps it's no accident that The Boy in the Field and The Road from Belhaven are both primarily about young people.
And so what? You think that stories about young people tend to be shorter?
No, I don't think that exactly. But I think in each case, I was very conscious that I was just glimpsing a part of their life or trying to capture a part of their life on the page. And that what I wanted was to create a sense of that life going on beyond the page.
And that's definitely there. And it's interesting to consider writing a character like Lizzie, you know, late 19th century, from childhood into early womanhood, and having to access her reality. I feel like some of us have an easier time getting back into that mode. Like, I'm amazed by people who can write adolescence really well with like just such vividness. Like, it's almost like they never left, you know? Was that a challenge for you? It's maybe not. Maybe like you had an easy time accessing Lizzie's girlhood.
Some parts of it were a challenge. I think partly trying to find my way to the mores of that time and people's attitudes, where, you know, a lot of public perception of the Victorian era is shaped by novels. But there's a reality behind those novels that differs quite a lot, and trying to find my way between our ideals about the Victorian period and the actuality was one of the challenges.
Yeah, that's one of the things I appreciated about it, is the fact that it was this is very much a three-dimensional view of what life was like then. It wasn't quite as simple as the kind of caricatured view of Victorian era existence and mores.
Yes.
People were still people.
Yeah, they were making mistakes.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So I'm wondering, I always ask people before we part company if they are working on anything new. You seem like somebody who's always got an iron in the fire, though I could be wrong. Like, are you working on something else?
I am. I'm trying to write a new novel. It's in its infancy. The premise of the novel so far is that it's about the occasion of somebody's will. I mean, you know, someone dies and leaves a will and the effect that has on their children.
Which is touched upon a little bit, interestingly, in The Road from Belhaven. There is a will in The Road from Belhaven.
Yeah, and I think I was really interested in that and wanted to explore that idea in more detail and how the dead try to exert their authority over the living.
Yeah, I had to write a will. I mean, I have kids, so you have to kind of do that.
Yeah.
But it was a weird process. I did it when I was in my 30s. It's been a while. I did it on like LegalZoom. I was like, I'm just going to do this. It's going to be legally binding, but it's not something I want to invest a lot of money in, basically.
Okay.
But I remember some of the questions you have to answer. It was like, where do you want to be buried? And what do you want to, I think like some of the answers I gave when I reflect back on it are kind of comical. I was like, I don't care. Just sprinkle me somewhere. It's not my concern. But,
Santa Monica.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But it's an interest that is fascinating. This process that we have to go through, where we're like, we're not going to be here, but we're sort of leaving instructions to people for some reason. So I will look forward to it. And I am very grateful to you for taking the time to talk. I know you're a little bit under the weather, so I appreciate you enduring all of my questions. And I congratulate you on The Road from Belhaven. It's a terrific book.
Thank you so much, Brad. You asked the best questions. I just think if I could talk to you for, say, 15 minutes every day, my writing life would be so much more fluent and efficient and profound.
I think that's part of the joy of this show, is getting to commiserate with other writers. And I don't know, just lovely to meet you, and lovely to get a chance to spend time talking with you about your work. And wish you all the best on this next project.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. Good luck with your project. Good luck with Twiggy.
Yeah.
And I hope you get to Scotland in the next few years. I'm all ready to be your guide when you decide to make the trip.
Listen, it's like near the top of my list of places I want to go. I want to go to North England, I want to go to Ireland, and I want to go to Scotland and just explore. Deeply fascinated with that place. And I have some family history, so it's a place I want to go visit, and just really fun to talk with you, and hope we get to do it again sometime.
Thank you so much. I hope that too.